welcome to the deep dive. We love to dig into the unusual here, and today is no exception. We've got some writing you sent in from a minister, and, well, let's just say their take on biblical prophecy is definitely off the beaten path.
Yeah, it's interesting. This minister is not just coming from an Armstrongism background, which already has its own unique interpretations, but it seems like they're part of a group that's even further removed from what most Christians would consider orthodox.
So we're talking double the intrigue, double the chance for some eyebrow-raising moments. Where do we even start with this? I mean, you've seen this kind of material before.
Well, the minister's writings really focus on reinterpreting those familiar biblical stories about Abraham's descendants and where they ended up. They're fixated on bloodlines and tracing national identities, but their conclusions are, well, not exactly what you'd hear in a typical Sunday sermon.
Okay, listeners, get ready for a twisty-turny deep dive through biblical history and prophecy. Because this minister starts off by trying to create this sense of urgency, almost like a conspiracy theory vibe. They're claiming that most people have totally misunderstood prophecy.
Yeah, classic move, right? It's like they're saying we've got this secret knowledge, this hidden truth that's been kept from the masses. And of course, America and Britain are at the center of it all, even though in traditional Christianity, those are considered Gentile nations.
Exactly. That's what caught my eye, too. It's this strange mix of familiar biblical stuff, but with totally unexpected players taking center stage. So how does this minister make that connection?
Well, they take a deep dive into the promises that God made to Abraham, but they divide those promises into two separate categories. One is all about material wealth and national power. The other is about spiritual blessings through Jesus. And this division is super important to their whole argument.
So it's like two sides of the same coin, worldly success versus spiritual salvation.
You got it. And they meticulously track how these two promises were passed down through the generations, starting with Abraham's sons. It's like an ancient inheritance drama, who got what.
And that's where things get super interesting, right? They talk about how the birthright, that promise of material prosperity, actually went to Joseph instead of Judah, who received this scepter, the line leading to Christ.
Right, and this distinction is super important for them because it allows them to argue that the Jews, the descendants of Judah, didn't inherit the full package of Abraham's blessings. That material birthright, they say, actually went to Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh.
Wait, Ephraim and Manasseh? I feel like I've heard those names, but I can't place them. What's the significance there?
That's where the minister makes their boldest claim. They link Ephraim and Manasseh to, drumroll please, America and Britain. They're saying that these modern nations are the true inheritors of that material birthright and are therefore responsible for fulfilling those ancient promises of global dominance.
Hold on. Are they saying that America and Britain are like the secret chosen people? That's a pretty big jump, even for someone reinterpreting biblical prophecy.
It is, and it gets even wilder. To justify this claim, they have to explain why the Israelites, the people we typically associate with those promises, seem to disappear from history. Their answer, they blame it on breaking the Sabbath.
Wait, the Sabbath? So keeping Saturday as the day of rest is the key to maintaining your status as God's chosen people.
According to them, yeah. They're claiming that abandoning the Sabbath led to the Israelites losing their identity and being scattered among the nations, basically becoming the lost tribes of Israel.
Okay, I'm starting to see how they tie it all together. They're building this alternative narrative where America and Britain are the true inheritors of those ancient promises.
Yeah.
And everyone else, even mainstream Christians who observe Sunday, has it all wrong.
Exactly. And this whole emphasis on the Sabbath is a hallmark of Armstrongism. It's a way for them to set themselves apart, to claim they have the true understanding of Scripture and that everyone else is in the dark.
It's amazing how they use something seemingly minor, like which day you observe is the day of rest, to build this whole elaborate belief system, one that justifies their claims about national identity and destiny.
Right. It's all about crafting a narrative, creating a sense of exclusivity, and drawing people into their very particular interpretation of history and prophecy.
So we've got America and Britain as the secret chosen people, the Sabbath as the key to maintaining that chosen status, and a whole lot of reinterpreting biblical history to make it fit. But where do they go from here?
Well, this is where things take a bit of a dark turn. The minister then uses this whole framework to explain why they believe that America and Britain are now in decline. And you guessed it, it all comes back to the Sabbath.
So they're basically saying that America and Britain dropped the ball, abandoned God's true Sabbath, and now they're paying the price.
That's the gist of it. They point to economic struggles, social problems, political conflicts, even natural disasters, as evidence that these nations are under divine judgment for their disobedience.
It's like they're saying, hey, America and Britain, you had one job. Keep the Sabbath and you'll be blessed. You messed up, so now you're facing the consequences.
And they take it even further, claiming that this decline is actually fulfilling specific biblical prophecies about the downfall of Israel, particularly those passages in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that talk about a sevenfold increase in punishment for disobedience.
A sevenfold. Wow, that's intense. But it's fascinating how they weave these ancient texts into their interpretation of modern events, almost like they're creating this grand narrative that links biblical prophecy to what's happening in the world right now.
Exactly, and that's what makes this kind of material so compelling. Even if we might disagree with their conclusions, it's a way of making sense of the world. Finding patterns and connections that seemingly explain the chaos and uncertainty of our times.
All right, listeners, buckle up because we're about to dive even deeper into this rabbit hole. This minister doesn't stop at just general trends and prophecies. They get super specific about how individual nations fit into this whole biblical framework. And their interpretations get even more, let's say, creative.
Oh, yeah. They try to link specific modern nations to the 12 tribes of Israel, drawing on everything from national emblems to cultural stereotypes to historical events. It's like a giant game of theological connect the dots, but with some pretty questionable connections being made along the way.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued.
Yeah.
Maybe a little terrified.
Yeah.
But before we get into those specific national connections, I think we need to take a step back and address the elephant in the room. Where did this whole idea of British Israelism, with its focus on Anglo-Saxon identity and destiny, even come from?
That's a great point. And it's crucial for understanding the context of this minister's writing. British Israelism, which had a huge influence on Herbert W. Armstrong, emerged in the 19th century. It drew on a blend of biblical interpretations, historical speculation, and to be honest, some pretty blatant racism.
Racism. Okay, now we're getting into some really uncomfortable territory.
Mm-hmm.
How did racism factor into this whole movement?
Well, one of the core tenets of British Israelism is the belief that the Anglo-Saxon people are the true descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, and therefore they inherit the promises of divine favor and global dominion that were originally given to the Israelites.
So they're essentially saying that white Europeans are God's chosen people. That's pretty disturbing, especially considering the historical context of colonialism and imperialism during the time this movement was emerging.
Exactly. This whole idea of Anglo-Saxon superiority was used to justify all sorts of things, from colonial expansion to racial segregation. It created a theological framework for the oppression and exploitation of non-white populations.
Wow, that's incredibly disturbing. It's amazing how easily seemingly harmless interpretations of biblical prophecy can be twisted to support harmful and discriminatory ideologies.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Herbert W. Armstrong, the founder of Armstrongism, didn't invent this stuff. He essentially repackaged and popularized ideas that were already circulating within British Israelism. Specifically, he drew heavily from a book called Judah's Scepter and Joseph's Birthright.
So it's not even original thinking. It's like a game of theological telephone with potentially dangerous ideas being passed down and reinterpreted through the generations.
Precisely. And it's worth noting that Armstrong himself had a history of making prophecies that failed to come true, which further undermines the credibility of his teachings, at least from a mainstream Christian perspective.
So we have a minister from a non-Christian cult within Armstrongism promoting ideas rooted in British Israelism, which itself has a history of racism and failed prophecies. Listeners, I know this is a lot to process, but it's essential to understand this background to fully grasp the claims this minister is making.
Right. And I think it's time we delve into some of the minister's specific interpretations of how modern nations fit into this biblical framework. We'll unpack their reasoning, explore the historical and theological context, and help you, the listener, decide what to make of their often controversial and sometimes downright bizarre conclusions.
All right, listeners, get ready for a wild ride through biblical history, national identities, and prophetic speculation. We're about to untangle this minister's intricate web of interpretations. And who knows what surprising connections we might uncover along the way. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. So we've laid the groundwork and talked about where some of these ideas come from. Let's really dig into how this minister applies these ideas to specific countries today.
Right. We know that they see America and Britain as the inheritors of that material birthright promised to Abraham. But what about everyone else? Where do other countries fit into this biblical puzzle they're building?
Well, they have this whole system for connecting modern nations to the 12 tribes of Israel. And it gets really complex. Like, they associate France with Reuben, Jacob's firstborn son, who lost his birthright because of some, let's say, poor choices.
Ah, I see what they did there. France, with its reputation for romantic scandals and revolutions, gets linked to the tribe that lost its inheritance because of impulsiveness and a lack of self-control. Pretty clever.
Exactly. They weave in historical events, cultural stereotypes, national emblems, even try to use personality traits to make these connections. Sometimes it's surprisingly insightful, but other times it feels like they're just forcing things to fit their narrative.
So it's like a mix of genuine historical observations with a big dose of confirmation bias.
You got it. And that's where it gets tricky. They pick and choose information to support what they already believe, ignoring anything that contradicts it. They're starting from this position where they assume that these nations must be connected to ancient Israel, so they're going to make the evidence fit somehow.
It's that old saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. They've got this British Israelism hammer, and they're just pounding away at modern history, trying to make it match their biblical blueprint.
Perfect analogy. And think about what this means theologically. By saying they've cracked the code on these hidden connections, they're basically claiming to have special knowledge. They're saying they understand God's plan better than everyone else.
It's like they're setting themselves up as prophets, claiming this unique insight into how God works in the world. And that can be really dangerous, especially when you combine it with the racist undertones of British Israelism.
Absolutely. It's a risky mix of theological speculation and nationalistic pride that can easily be used to justify all kinds of bad beliefs and behavior.
Okay, so we've got this framework where modern nations are linked to those ancient tribes.
Hmm.
But how does the minister actually interpret current events using this framework? What are they saying about the state of the world and where it's all headed?
Get ready for some serious doom and gloom. They see all the unrest and turmoil in the world, economic problems, political conflicts, natural disasters, as signs that we're in the end times, like the final chapter before Jesus comes back.
So they're basically looking at news headlines through those special apocalypse glasses we talked about, seeing confirmation of their prophetic timeline everywhere they look.
Exactly. And they think that America and Britain, as the supposed descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh, are playing a central role in all of this. But because they've abandoned the Sabbath and strayed from God's ways, they're facing judgment.
So it's like they're the chosen people who messed up big time, and now the whole world is suffering because of it.
That's the idea. They point to things like the decline of American manufacturing, the rise of social unrest, even Brexit, as evidence that these nations are experiencing the consequences of their actions.
It's amazing how they can twist anything to fit their narrative. It's like they're watching a movie with those 3D glasses, but instead of seeing depth, they're seeing prophecy fulfilled everywhere.
It's quite the mental gymnastics routine. And it's important to remember this kind of apocalyptic thinking isn't unique to them. It has a long history in Christianity and other religions, often popping up during times of crisis.
Well, yeah. When the world feels like it's falling apart, it's comforting to think that someone has a roadmap, that there's a plan, even if it involves a lot of doom and gloom.
Right. And that's what makes this kind of message so appealing to some. It offers certainty in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. But it's important to be careful, think critically about these claims, and not get caught up in the fear and paranoia.
Okay, so they see America and Britain headed for a downfall. But what about everyone else? What's their take on the future of the world as a whole?
To be honest, it's pretty grim. They believe the world is headed towards a period of intense tribulation, a time of global conflict, natural disasters, economic collapse, and widespread suffering. They see it as this necessary cleansing, a divine judgment on a sinful and rebellious humanity.
It's like they're those fire and brimstone preachers from old-time religion, predicting hellfire and damnation for everyone who doesn't get right with God.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this kind of talk can be really dangerous, especially when it reaches people who are already feeling scared, vulnerable, or pushed aside. It can lead to extremism, isolation, even violence.
So it's not just some harmless interpretation of biblical prophecy. It can have real-world consequences, especially when it fuels fear, hatred, and that us versus them mentality.
Right, and we need to keep that in mind as we look at their specific predictions about the future. It's crucial to separate their interpretation from the actual message of the Bible, which offers hope and redemption, not just doom and gloom.
All right, listeners, get ready for the grand finale. We're about to unpack this minister's timeline for the end of the world And trust me, it's a doozy.
We'll explore their predictions about what's going to happen, break down their interpretations of biblical prophecies, and help you make sense of this complicated world of apocalyptic thinking. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Whew! After that last segment, I kind of feel like I need a stiff drink and a hug. It's a lot to take in. Someone laying out this whole bleak and honestly kind of terrifying view of the future.
Yeah, it can be unsettling, especially when it's presented with such certainty.
Yeah.
And all wrapped up in the language of biblical authority. But that's why we're here, right? To unpack these ideas, to think about them critically, and help you, the listener, come to your own conclusions.
Right. And let's face it, there's this weird fascination with apocalyptic scenarios. Like, we can't help but rubberneck at a potential train wreck, even though we know it's probably not a good thing to do.
Go, it's definitely a human thing, that draw to drama and sensationalism, especially when you're dealing with these big questions about life, death, the whole meaning of existence.
So let's get into that a little bit. This minister lays out a pretty detailed timeline for how they think these end-time events are going to go down. What are some of the key moments they predict?
Well, they think the decline of America and Britain, which they see is already happening, is going to keep speeding up, leading to economic collapse, social unrest, and ultimately military defeat.
So they're predicting a total implosion of these countries that were once considered superpowers. Kind of hard to imagine given where they stand in the world today.
It is. But remember, they're working with this very specific interpretation of biblical prophecy. One that sees these nations as having a divinely ordained role in this whole end times drama.
And because they supposedly abandoned God's way, turned their back on the Sabbath, embraced all kinds of wickedness, they're doomed to fall from grace, right?
That's how they see it. They believe these nations are being punished for their disobedience, and that their downfall is part of God's plan for the world.
Okay, but it's not just about America and Britain, right? They've got predictions about what's going to happen globally, too.
Oh, absolutely. It gets much broader and even more dramatic. They foresee this rise in global conflict. Wars, famines, natural disasters, all increasing in frequency and intensity. They even talk about a one-world government forming, some kind of tyrannical system that will try to control everything.
Wow, it's like they've taken every dystopian sci-fi movie and mashed them together into one giant apocalyptic nightmare.
You're not wrong. There's definitely a lot of overlap with how pop culture portrays the end of the world, and that's part of why this stuff is so captivating, even if we don't consciously buy into it. We've been exposed to these narratives through books, movies, TV shows, even video games.
It's like those stories have prepped us to be more receptive to these kinds of predictions, even if they seem outlandish or far-fetched.
Exactly. We're already familiar with the tropes, the characters, the language of apocalyptic thinking, so it's easier for these ideas to take root in our minds.
Okay, so we've got global chaos, tyrannical governments, natural disasters, the works. But there's a climax, right? A final showdown between good and evil.
Right. They believe all this turmoil builds up to a final battle, what's often called Armageddon, where the forces of good, led by Jesus, will go head-to-head with the forces of evil, led by the Antichrist.
So classic battle between good and evil, light versus darkness.
Totally. And they think this battle will be the ultimate test for humanity, a final judgment that decides who's saved and who's condemned.
And naturally, they believe they're on the right side. The ones with the truth will be protected from God's wrath.
Yep. And that's a big part of their appeal, especially for people who feel lost, confused, or just disillusioned with the world. They offer a sense of belonging, of purpose, of being part of something bigger.
It's like they're saying, hey, join our side and you'll be safe when everything goes to hell.
Pretty much. But remember, this kind of thinking can be really harmful. It creates this us versus them mentality, this idea of righteous insiders versus evil outsiders.
Yeah.
And that can lead to all sorts of bad things.
Right, like judging, condemning, even persecuting those who don't share their beliefs.
Exactly. We need to be really careful about buying into this kind of apocalyptic rhetoric, especially when it's being used to justify hatred, intolerance, or violence.
Okay, so for argument's sake, let's say this minister's timeline is right. All these terrible things are going to happen. What's the end game? What happens when the dust settles after this cosmic battle?
Well, they believe that after evil is defeated, Jesus is going to set up his kingdom on earth, a 1,000-year reign of peace, justice, and righteousness.
So it's like a happy ending, but with a ton of apocalyptic craziness leading up to it.
Yeah, pretty much. They see this kingdom as a time of incredible prosperity, spiritual awakening, and harmony between people and nature. It's their version of paradise restored.
But I bet there's a twist. Not everyone gets to be part of this paradise, do they?
You're catching on. They believe that only those who have accepted their interpretation of Scripture, who've repented and joined their movement, will be part of this new kingdom. Everyone else is facing eternal damnation.
So it's like this exclusive club, a gated community for the theologically righteous.
Exactly, and that's a big part of their appeal, especially for people looking for a sense of belonging, purpose, and security in a world that often feels chaotic.
It's like they're offering VIP access to the best afterlife party, but only if you play by their rules.
Great analogy. But remember, this kind of you're either in or you're out thinking isn't really in line with the message of Jesus. He offered salvation to everyone who believes in him, regardless of their background or beliefs.
So even though this minister claims to have the inside scoop on God's plan for the future, it's crucial to keep in mind that their interpretation is just one among many, and it's one that comes with a lot of baggage and potential for harm.
Couldn't agree more. As we wrap up this deep dive, I think there are a few important takeaways for our listeners. First, be cautious of any interpretation of Scripture that promotes fear, hatred, or division. Second, always remember that God's love and grace are open to everyone, not just a select group. And finally, focus on living a life that reflects Christ's teachings of love, compassion, and justice. Instead of getting caught up in timelines or trying to predict the future.
Well said. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this wild ride through biblical prophecy, national identity, and apocalyptic predictions. We hope this deep dive gave you something to think about and maybe equipped you to navigate these complicated and confusing topics with more wisdom and discernment. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper.